I'm Ivy 31, and I never thought my own parents would betray me over $10 million. My grandfather promised me his fortune, but instead I watched in horror as my parents handed everything to my younger sister Margaret, while I was physically dragged from our family home by my hair. What they didn't know is that I had been preparing for this possibility for years. I had a plan that would not only restore what was rightfully mine, but would make them deeply regret their actions. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about finding justice when family betrays you. I grew up in Boston's elite Beacon Hill neighborhood in a sprawling brownstone that had been in our family for generations. My father William was the CEO of our family's investment firm, and my mother Eleanor was a fixture in Boston's social scene, chairing charity galas and sitting on museum boards. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect American family. But behind closed doors, the truth was very different. From my earliest memories, there was always a stark difference in how my parents treated me versus my younger sister Margaret. While I was expected to excel in everything, Margaret was coddled and praised for minimal effort. I remember my 10th birthday when I received practical gifts like educational books, while Margaret's celebrations months later featured ponies, professional entertainers, and designer clothes, even though she was only 6. The only person who truly saw me was my grandfather Lawrence. He was a self-made man who had built our family's investment firm from scratch after serving in the military. He had a sharp mind for business and an even sharper sense of fairness. When my parents were busy fawning over Margaret's grandfather, Lawrence would invite me to his study. There, surrounded by leather-bound books and the smell of his pipe tobacco, he taught me about finance, business strategy, and most importantly, the value of preparation. "The world isn't fair, Ivy," he would tell me, his blue eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "But that doesn't mean you have to accept injustice. You just need to be smarter and more prepared than those who would wrong you." Our family business, Lawrence Financial Group, was worth hundreds of millions, with clients ranging from old money families to tech entrepreneurs. Grandfather had built it, my father had expanded it, and it was understood that someday Margaret and I would inherit it together. But privately, Grandfather told me he worried about the company's future under my father's leadership, which he felt had become too focused on short-term gains rather than the client-centered approach he had built the firm on. As the years passed, the disparity in how we were treated only grew more obvious. When I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class, my parents attended but left early for one of Margaret's soccer games. When I got into Harvard Business School, my mother simply said, "Well, the family name certainly helped, didn't it?" But when Margaret barely managed to graduate from a mid-tier college, my parents threw an extravagant party and gifted her a luxury car. Despite this, I worked hard, earned my MBA, and joined the family firm as an analyst. I wanted to learn the business from the ground up, even though I could have demanded a director-level position. Grandfather Lawrence was the only one who noticed my dedication. During one of our private lunches, he made me a promise that changed everything. "Ivy, I've set aside $10 million and my 20% stake in the company specifically for you in my will," he said. "Your sister will be well taken care of by your parents, but you need this protection. I've seen how they treat you." I was moved to tears, not just because of the money, but because someone finally acknowledged the unfairness I'd lived with my entire life. But as grandfather's health began to decline, he became increasingly concerned about my future. "Your parents may try to circumvent my wishes," he warned me during one of his more lucid days as Parkinson's began to take its toll. "They've always resented that I see through their favoritism. Start documenting everything now. Knowledge and evidence are power." Taking his advice to heart, I began keeping detailed records of family business matters, conversations, and the continuing pattern of favoritism. Little did I know how crucial this documentation would soon become. The day of Grandfather Lawrence's funeral was appropriately gray and rainy. As I stood beside his casket, I felt truly alone for the first time. He had been my advocate, my mentor, and my only ally in the family. The service was lavish, attended by Boston's elite and financial luminaries from across the country, all paying respects to a true titan of industry. 3 days later, we gathered in the wood-paneled conference room at the family firm for the reading of the will. I sat straight-backed in my chair, hands folded in my lap, expecting to hear the confirmation of what grandfather had promised me. Instead, I watched in growing horror as the family lawyer Richard Preston, a longtime friend of my father, read terms completely different from what grandfather had described to me. The sum of $10 million and 20% ownership stake in Lawrence Financial Group is to be given to Margaret Claire Lawson. Richard read, not meeting my eyes. My heart stopped. This couldn't be right. I looked around the table, seeing my sister's poorly concealed smile and my parents' solemn but satisfied expressions. They had anticipated my reaction and were prepared for it. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the earthquake happening inside me. Grandfather specifically told me those assets were designated for me. My father cleared his throat. Your grandfather and I had many discussions in his final months, Ivy. He came to realize that Margaret needs the financial security more than you do. You're already established in your career, while Margaret is still finding her way. Finding her way? Margaret had never held a job for more than 3 months and had been living off a generous allowance from our parents while she found herself for the past 4 years since college. I don't believe you, I said, my voice growing stronger with anger. I want to see the original documents. When was this will dated? Was it after his Parkinson's diagnosis? Who witnessed it? My mother's face hardened. Are you suggesting we manipulated your grandfather? That's a terrible accusation, Ivy. I thought we raised you better than that. The conversation moved to the living room of our family home, where the tension escalated. I demanded to see the original will documents, certain they had been altered or that grandfather had been coerced when his mind was failing. You've always been jealous of your sister, my mother said, her voice cold. Always competing for attention. This is exactly why your grandfather changed his mind. He saw this ugly side of you. Margaret approached me with a hand on my arm and fake sympathy in her eyes. I'm sorry you're upset, Ivy. I didn't ask for this. Maybe I can give you some of it, alone perhaps. That condescending offer broke something in me. I shrugged off her hand and turned to my parents. Grandfather warned me you might do this. He told me to be prepared. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red. Your grandfather was losing his mind at the end. Whatever he told you was the rambling of a confused old man. He was confused enough for you to take advantage of him, wasn't he? I shot back. What happened next still plays in my nightmares. My father lunged forward, grabbing a fistful of my hair so violently that I cried out in pain. He literally dragged me toward the front door while my mother watched and Margaret stood frozen in shock. You ungrateful little bitch, he hissed, his face inches from mine. After everything we've done for you, you have 2 choices: accept the situation or be cut off completely. No job, no family, nothing. He shoved me out onto the porch, threw my purse after me, and slammed the door. Shaking and in tears, I drove away from my childhood home, the physical pain of my scalp nothing compared to the searing betrayal I felt inside. What my family didn't know was that I had indeed taken my grandfather's warning seriously. 3 years earlier, after one particularly clear conversation about his concerns, I had begun to prepare for exactly this scenario. Trust is good, Ivy, grandfather had told me, but documentation is better. Grandfather Lawrence was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. He had survived business deals with sharks and had outlasted numerous attempts to hostile takeovers of his company. He knew what my parents were capable of, and he had taught me to be equally strategic. In the weeks following being thrown out of my family home, I moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. To anyone watching, it appeared I was struggling after being cut off. In reality, this was part of my plan. I needed my family to underestimate me and believe they had won. What nobody knew was that I had been meeting secretly with Benjamin Aldridge, my grandfather's personal attorney, who had been sidelined by my father years ago. Benjamin had been loyal to my grandfather for decades and had never approved of how my father ran the business or treated me. Your grandfather anticipated this, Benjamin told me during one of our clandestine meetings at a quiet cafe far from the financial district where we might be recognized. He left a sealed letter with me and a key to a safe deposit box that only you can access. That safe deposit box contained the original copy of my grandfather's true will, properly witnessed and notarized, dated just 6 months before his death when his medical records still showed him to be mentally competent. It also contained audio recordings of my grandfather explaining his wishes in detail and expressing concerns that my father might try to circumvent them. The will your father presented was dated 2 weeks before your grandfather's death, when hospital records show he was heavily medicated and often confused, Benjamin explained. We have a case, but challenging, it will be ugly. Family business always is. While Benjamin quietly began preparing the legal challenge, I focused on other aspects of my plan. My law school education and years working in the family business had given me intimate knowledge of our operations' client relationships and the company's strengths and weaknesses. I began reaching out to key clients, many of whom had personal relationships with my grandfather and had never fully warmed to my father's management style. I was careful never explicitly criticizing my family, but asking thoughtful questions about their service experience and future needs. Many were surprised to learn I was no longer with the firm and curious about the circumstances. I also reconnected with my grandfather's old business partners, several of whom had been gradually sidelined by my father, but still held small ownership stakes and influence in the industry. They were more than willing to share their concerns about the direction of Lawrence Financial under my father's leadership. Most importantly, I identified and recruited several talented employees who had been overlooked or mistreated by my parents. These were loyal, capable people who knew the inner workings of the firm and were increasingly dissatisfied with the toxic culture my father had created. Your grandfather built this company on relationships and integrity, said Thomas, a senior account manager who had been with the firm for 20 years but had been repeatedly passed over for promotion in favor of my father's golf buddies. Those values have been eroding for years. While my parents believed I was licking my wounds in isolation, I was actually building a network and reputation of my own. I established myself as someone with integrity, vision, and the same client-centered approach that had made my grandfather successful. All the while, I appeared to be struggling financially, driving an old car, wearing the same few outfits to industry events, and living in my modest apartment. The foundation of my plan was in place. Now I just needed patience for the right moment to begin the next phase. 6 months after being thrown out of my family home, I attended the annual Children's Hospital Benefit Gala, an event my mother had chaired for the past decade. I couldn't afford a new gown, so I wore a classic black dress I'd had for years, accessorized carefully to look elegant rather than dated. I knew my appearance there would surprise my family, but that was part of my strategy. As expected, my parents were holding court near the entrance, my mother draped in a designer gown and diamonds, my father looking distinguished in his tuxedo. Margaret stood beside them in a revealing red dress, giggling at something a silver-haired board member was saying. Their faces registered shock when they saw me, quickly masked with cold indifference. My mother deliberately turned away when I approached. My father gave me a curt nod and said, "Ivy," as though I were a distant acquaintance rather than his daughter. Margaret at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Nice dress," she said, her eyes telegraphing that she recognized it from years ago. "Thank you," I replied, simply before moving to the bar. Throughout the evening, I made a point of having quiet conversations with several important clients of Lawrence Financial. I didn't approach them as a group or make any scene. I simply reconnected, asked about their families, and listened attentively to their concerns. Many expressed surprise that I was no longer with the firm and seemed genuinely disappointed. "Your insights were always so helpful," said Jonathan Mercer, whose tech company's pension fund was one of our largest accounts. "The new advisor they assigned us doesn't understand our industry at all." By the time dinner was served, I could feel my parents watching me with growing suspicion. My mother cornered me in the ladies' room later that evening. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, checking to make sure we were alone. "Are you trying to poach clients? Your father will sue you for breach of contract if you take even one account." I smiled calmly. I'm attending a charity event and catching up with old friend's mother. Nothing in my exit agreement prevents that. Stay away from our clients, she warned before stalking out. What my mother didn't realize was that her public confrontation had been witnessed by the wife of another major client who immediately asked me what had happened. The story began to circulate, raising questions about why the daughter of the company's founders was being treated so poorly. Over the next few months, Lawrence Financial began losing major clients. Not all at once, but a steady trickle that began to concern the board. My father tried to blame market conditions or fee structures, but the truth was that many clients were uncomfortable with how the company was being run and the stories they'd heard about my treatment. Margaret, who had been given a senior position she was utterly unqualified for, was failing miserably at maintaining client relationships. Her lack of financial knowledge and professional experience was glaringly obvious in meetings, and her attempts to charm clients with the same flirtatious behavior that worked on her social circle fell flat with serious investors. My parents began reaching out to me first with threatening legal letters claiming I was violating non-compete clauses, then with awkward phone calls suggesting we clear the air. When those approaches failed, they sent mutual friends to suggest reconciliation dinners. I maintained strategic silence, never responding directly but letting it be known through industry contacts that I was open to resolution that respected my grandfather's wishes. This measured response made me appear reasonable while my parents seemed increasingly desperate. What truly sent them into panic mode was when they discovered I had established my own boutique investment advisory firm, Laurel Advisors, named after my grandfather's middle name. While small, my firm was attracting attention for its innovative approach and personalized service, exactly the values my grandfather had originally built our family company on. "She knows too much," I overheard my father telling a board member at another industry event. "Client preferences, our fee structures, everything. She was too quiet all those years, just watching and learning." He was right to be worried. I knew more than he realized. Exactly 1 year after being thrown out of my family home, I met with Benjamin at his office to finalize our legal strategy. "We're ready," he said, spreading documents across his desk. "We have the original will, the audio recordings, and medical records showing your grandfather's mental state was compromised when the revised will was created. We also have sworn statements from his nurse and his housekeeper about your father's unusual number of private meetings with your grandfather in those final weeks." I nodded, feeling a strange calm. "And the other matter?" Benjamin smiled grimly. "The financial documentation you provided has been thoroughly reviewed by our forensic accountants. There are significant irregularities that the board and the SEC would find very interesting." The next day, an emergency board meeting of Lawrence Financial was called by several minority shareholders concerned about the recent client departures and rumors of financial mismanagement. My father was blindsided when I walked into the boardroom alongside Benjamin and 2 forensic accountants. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded. "She has no standing here." "Actually," said Robert Chen, one of my grandfather's oldest friends and a board member, "Ms. Lawson was specifically invited by several board members who are concerned about the direction of the company." For the next 2 hours, I presented a detailed dossier showing how my father had been mismanaging company funds, inflating performance numbers, and making increasingly risky investments to cover losses. Most damning of all was evidence that Margaret had been embezzling from client accounts for nearly 2 years to cover shopping addiction and gambling debts, and my parents had helped cover it up when discovered. "This isn't just unethical," I concluded. "Some of it is potentially criminal, and it violates everything this company was built to stand for." The board was stunned into silence. Then came the questions, each one driving home how thoroughly I had documented the problems and how completely my parents had lost control. The final blow came when my former assistant, Amanda, who still worked at the company, stood up. "I've been gathering additional evidence of misconduct at Ms. Lawson's request," she said, placing a flash drive on the table, "including recordings of Mr. Lawson instructing staff to alter reports to clients." By the end of the meeting, the board had called for a vote of no confidence in my father's leadership. As we left the building, news was already leaking to financial press contacts, and the company's stock was beginning to slide. Meanwhile, Benjamin filed our legal challenge to the fraudulent will. With the evidence we had gathered, the case moved quickly through the courts. My parents' attorneys advised them to settle rather than face public testimony about how they had manipulated my grandfather in his final days. The final showdown took place in the same boardroom where I had been humiliated a year earlier. My parents sat across from me, their faces showing the strain of the past months. Margaret sat beside them, eyes red from crying. "This witch hunt has gone far enough," my father began, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "This isn't a witch hunt," I replied calmly. "This is accountability." The court had already ruled in my favor regarding the contested will restoring my inheritance of $10 million and the 20% ownership stake in the company. The board's investigation into the financial irregularities had confirmed all of my allegations. "I have a gambling problem," Margaret suddenly blurted out, tears streaming down her face. "And shopping. I couldn't stop. Dad and Mom were just trying to protect me." "By stealing from clients who trusted us?" I asked, not unkindly. "By betraying grandfather's legacy." My mother reached for my hand across the table. I let her take it, but felt nothing. "We made terrible mistakes, Ivy. We can find a way forward as a family." The board chairman cleared his throat. "The question before us is the leadership of this company going forward. The violations we've uncovered are serious enough to warrant criminal charges." This was my moment. The moment I had been planning for a year. I could destroy them completely or offer a lifeline. "I have a proposal," I said. "I'll help salvage the family and company reputation and prevent criminal charges, but in exchange I want control. My father and mother will publicly step down. Margaret will repay everything she took and enter treatment, and I will become CEO." There was a stunned silence around the table. Then the board chairman spoke. "Given Ms. Lawson's detailed understanding of the company's issues and her clear plan for resolving them, I believe this is our best option to avoid a complete collapse of client confidence." The vote was unanimous in my favor. My father looked utterly defeated as he was asked to surrender his company credentials. My mother sat in stunned silence. Margaret seemed almost relieved that her secrets were finally out. Over the next 6 months, I implemented a recovery plan that saved the company from what could have been a catastrophic failure. I personally called each major client, transparently explaining what had happened and my plans to restore the firm's integrity. Most stayed impressed by my honesty and vision. Margaret was given a small role with strictly supervised responsibilities after completing her initial treatment program. My parents were forced to make a public apology and officially step down from all company positions. In the end, I controlled not just my $10 million inheritance and 20% ownership stake, but the entire family empire. Former clients began returning, attracted by the renewed focus on ethical management and personalized service. Under my leadership, the company began a remarkable turnaround that financial media called the resurrection of Lawrence Financial. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to take everything from me, my parents had ultimately lost everything themselves. 2 years after that boardroom confrontation, Lawrence Financial, now rebranded as Laurel Financial Group in honor of my grandfather, was more successful than ever. Our client base had grown by 30%, and our reputation for integrity had attracted a new generation of investors looking for ethical wealth management. One of my first acts as CEO was to establish the Lawrence Foundation, dedicated to financial education for underprivileged youth. The foundation became my passion project, a way to honor my grandfather's belief that knowledge was the greatest equalizer. The path to personal healing was longer and more difficult than the professional victory. For months after taking control of the company, I worked 18-hour days, partly from necessity, but also to avoid confronting the emotional wreckage my family had created. Eventually, at the urging of my closest friends, I began seeing a therapist to process the betrayal and rebuild my sense of self-worth. My relationship with my parents remained strictly professional and extremely limited. They had moved to a much smaller home in a less prestigious neighborhood, their social standing diminished by the scandal. When absolutely necessary, we communicated through attorneys or assistants. With Margaret, there was a tentative path toward reconciliation. After 6 months of intensive therapy for her gambling and shopping addictions, she reached out to me with a handwritten letter of apology. It was the first genuine communication I could remember receiving from her. "I was raised to believe I deserved special treatment," she wrote. "It wasn't until I lost everything that I realized how empty my life was and how badly I'd treated you." We began meeting monthly for coffee, our conversations awkward at first, but gradually developing into something that, while not the close sisterhood I had once longed for, was at least honest. The most unexpected gift of this painful journey was the family I created for myself. My team at Laurel Financial became my closest allies. Benjamin, my grandfather's attorney, became a mentor and father figure. And I formed deep friendships with people who valued me for who I was, not for my family name or what I could do for them. Through it all, I kept my grandfather's photo on my desk, a reminder of the man who had seen my potential and tried to protect me. I often thought about what he would make of how things had turned out. I learned that preparation truly does beat reaction, that patience defeats impulsiveness, and that documentation is indeed power. I learned the value of having allies who know the truth and stand by you when everyone else believes the lies. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that justice doesn't have to mean revenge. Creating something better than what was taken from you is the most powerful response to betrayal. As for forgiveness, I came to see it as a choice rather than an obligation. I could choose to release the anger and resentment for my own peace without pretending the harm never occurred. I found peace not in reconciliation with those who had wronged me, but in honoring my grandfather's legacy while creating my own path. If you're facing family betrayal like I did, remember that your story isn't over. The people who try to write you off don't get to decide your ending. You do. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who treated you unfairly? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding your own path to success. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply building something beautiful from the ashes of what others tried to destroy.